Today I will speak on Tennyson's great poem, In Memoriam, which I have titled as Water of Life, a Study in Memoriam. Tennyson spoke of In Memoriam as a way of the soul. The value of the poem, however, is not in this philosophic afterthought, but in its lyrical and meditative record of changing moods. There is the gradual healing of grief with the continuous and widening of love, so spiritualized that it can exist without the presence of the beloved. According to A.C. Baugh, from both the poetical and philosophical points of view, this dichotomy is part of the lasting attractiveness of In Memoriam. The concessions to the scientific spirit have been decided as feeble attempt to rescue something from the wreck of creeds they express characteristic Victorian state of mind. In Memoriam, moved by grief at the premature death of his friend Arthur Hallam, Tennyson sets down his thoughts on life and death, revealing the anguish of the search after grounds for belief in immortality and the torment of the modern and oscillating between the hopes offered by Christianity and the negations of science. Deliberately quiet and even in the tone and made up of short stanza, it is one of the most beautiful elegies in the language. It is also Tennyson's most truly philosophical work. Tennyson had ambitions to make his poem much more than the expression of merely personal feeling. It must be remembered, he said, that this is a poem, not an actual biography. I is not always the author speaking of himself, but the voice of the human race speaking through him. When, on the other hand, Tennyson generalizes his feelings and takes upon himself the burden of speaking for the human race, the poetry is far less acceptable. Yet, it was this aspect of the poem that gave in its astonishing popularity. Writing on the use of local color in the poem, Pinion says that undoubtedly the most memorable impressions of In Memoriam were natural scenes, whether panoramic or glimpses near and far. I climbed the hill from end to end. Of all the landscape underneath, I find no place that does not breathe some gracious memory of my friend. I repeat the poem again. I climbed the hill from end to end. Of all the landscape underneath, I find no place that does not breathe some gracious memory of my friend. So profound and tragic. These glimpses are obviously not from different places, but also from different seasons, and they are in record with the poet's moods and feelings. These scenes are steeped in the poet's emotions. A.B. Pinion is of the opinion that In Memoriam is highly a speculative religious poem. In Memoriam, the different moods of sorrow, as in drama, are dramatically given. He writes, and my conviction is that fear, doubts and suffering will find answer and relief only through faith in a God of love. It was meant to be a kind of divine comedy ending with happiness. Huxley wrote that Tennyson was the only modern poet, perhaps the only poet since Lucretius, who had taken points to study the work and methods of scientists. The study of natural life, geology and astronomy had led to conclusions which cast doubt on many of the fundamentals of biblical Christianity and made them appear to many what Carlyle called Hebrew old clothes. Tennyson could not accept ready-made faith. He knew that, although fundamental problems are the same from age to age, creeds change forms as knowledge grows. With faith that comes of self-control, the truths that never can be proved. He could not ignore the discoveries of modern science, but wisdom was higher than knowledge. Until we close with all we loved, and all we flow from soul in soul. With Keats, Browning and St. Paul, Tennyson believed that life is a value of soul-making. The water of life, which arises in our spiritual rock, comes from Christ, the strong Son of God, immortal love, who is one of the Creator. It flows through our deeds and makes them pure if only we submit to it. His will, for our will is free, whatever the evil in man or nature. Tennyson trusts that all will turn to good and every winter change to spring. Tennyson's greater faith is in immortality, and this again is evolutionary in conception. According to Tennyson, man is a spiritual being and will not die. Tennyson holds on to his dream of perfection, commanded by love, which is God's effluence and will redeem mankind on earth, and which lifts our hearts to Him, from whom we come and into whom eventually we shall return. Tennyson's poetry is not as rich in illustrative imagery as Shakespeare's, but his metaphors are striking and appropriate. As for example, Shaken from Frost by Grief is perhaps best of all the conclusions when Tennyson slips the thoughts of life and death. And all the breeze of fancy blows, and every dew drops paints a bow. The wizard lightnings deeply grow. And every thought breaks out a rose. Like Virgil, Tennyson is the landscape lover with admirable choice and economy of word. He flashes pictures. He is indeed the painter's hand, and he is at his best with what is familiar to him. In Memoriam is a highly religious superlative poem. In Memoriam is the only one great English personal elegy outside the pastoral tradition of Lycidas, Adonais, and Thyrsis. Nor did Tennyson take refuge to facile Platonics. He could not ignore contemporary science. Anything contributing to the spread of truth had to be considered. His faith was in the evolution of race and of the individual soul on earth and after death. He experienced the fundamental truth of experience and presented an enlightened optimism with a tremendous impact on Victorian age. It voiced the anguish, questioning hope and faith. There is a progression in the poem. First, we have bitter grief, which changes slowly to stoical endurance, then renewing faith in conflict with doubts and regrets. Then, despite minor grievances, come peace of mind, happy recollections of Hallam, and answered sense of spiritual communion, and finally, supreme optimism for the future of man on earth, and joyful belief in the progress of souls in states beyond until supreme felicity is attained. According to T.S. Eliot, Tennyson's greatness lies in abundance, variety, and competence. To Eliot, In Memoriam is a message of hope and reassurance to the fading Christian faith. It is not religious because of quality of its faith, but because of the quality of its doubt. Tennyson attains spiritual height where he says that man is not a machine like Paul. He had fought successfully against death. In Memoriam is a sad poem but ends on a cheerful, happy note. It will be in fitness of things to say that In Memoriam begins with a funeral and ends with a marriage, begins with death and ends in promise of new life, a sort of divine comedy, cheerful at the close. Tennyson belongs to the great tradition of English poetry. Here and there an expression, perhaps a single word, echoes a classical poet like Dante or Shakespeare or Milton or Wordsworth, and many is enriched with overtones of associated thought and sentiment. The lyrical notes are the echoes of the unique lyricism and imagery of Blake, sometimes recalling Herbert, sometimes the style is conversational, rhetorical, elaborate and forced, sometimes sentimental. With admirable choice and economy of words, he flashes pictures. His is indeed a painter's hand. The poem creates general and lasting impression upon the readers. Tennyson does not accept the view that man is a machine driven by electricity, generated by the brain or body endowed with knowledge. If science can prove this rationality, he will have none of it. He was born to other things. Tennyson is only a minor Virgil. He is also with Virgil as Dante saw him, a Virgil among the shades, the saddest of all English poets, among the great in limbo, the most instinctive rebel against a society in which he was the most conformist. Thank you.